Jai Bhim, everyone, and a big salam. It would be lovely if you showed your faces. It is a rare occasion to actually be surrounded by so many friendly faces. My name is Anjali Arandekar, and along with Darda Newman and Megan Moody, I am the co-director of UCSC Center for South Asian Studies. I also want to thank Nelson Hutchinson, our graduate assistant, who has been laboring behind the scenes to make this ambiance possible for all of us. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which UCSC stands is the unceded territory of the Awaswas speaking UP tribe, the Amamutsan tribal brand, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people who are working today to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands. Now, the Center for South Asia, as many of you here know, if you've attended and supported our events before, is a newly established research unit at UCSC focusing explicitly on justice, broadly defined, economic, feminist, environmental, social, and so much more within South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. So today, for us to stand in solidarity with our Palestinian kin is to precisely embrace the educational mission of justice that we have set forth for ourselves. To work in South Asia, as most of you here know, especially today, is to foreground and simultaneously resist histories of occupation, authoritarianism, as we see in Indian occupied Kashmir, and the foundational disposability of minoritized bodies, as we have seen in these extraordinarily alarming past few weeks of the pandemic, marked by caste, religion, gender, region, and labor segmentation. The escalation of COVID infections in rural India, particularly, for example, in Maharashtra, is something that we need to keep our attention on. Thus, to refuse the authority of the apartheid state, that is Israel, is to embark on the same journey. To refuse Hindutva is to refuse Zionism. To speak of Azad Kashmir is to speak of free Palestine. At the heart of our struggles remains the enduring question of the subaltern life worlds within which our collectivities survive, resist, refuse, and sometimes surrender. After all, yesterday marked Kala Divas, Black Day, the 6-month anniversary of the Kisan Andolan, the farmers' protests in India, which continue to endure and inspire despite all odds. Today also marks the final event of our year-long series towards justice, and what a year it has been. We thank you all for your extraordinary support in making our tiny little center come alive and for allowing us to carve collectivities to educate, organize, and agitate, especially in these extenuating and heartbreaking times. We hope to continue our work with you next year when we will be launching a second year-long series, also 75% on Zoom, in our hope to extend beyond borders, this time focused on the concept of dissent across South Asia and the Indian Ocean worlds. As such, I am delighted that we will be ending our year with two wonderful new books that signal precisely the kind of trenchant historical reading and engagement that we hope to engender. When Sheetal, Junaid, and I were chatting about this event, Junaid suggested we call it Bombay Katta, and we loved it. Katta here, not to be confused with Bombay Kutta, which certainly merits an entire session on its own, but Katta, a broad, vibrant Marathi and Kannada word that speaks of gatherings, meetings, in my case, raucous parties, and the sharing of food, words, libations, and more. As I was organizing the details for this event, one extra special, extra erudite friend, Shahnaz, from Lucknow, WhatsApped me with great urgency and said, "Are Baba Anjali, you Bombay types are so clueless. Katta in Uttar Pradesh," she told me with great exasperation, "is a small desi and very popular handgun, tamachas," she said. I'll just leave it there and say here that Uttar Pradesh is its own special place. Let me turn now to the pleasurable task of introducing our two interlocutors. This will be a format unlike none you have seen before. We will have two stalwarts of colonial Bombay engaging in a jugalbandi where will they go back and forth, discuss their books, and raise exciting questions for us. So Sheetal Chhabria, our first interlocutor, is a historian of South Asia, associate professor of history at Connecticut College, and a scholar of the production of poverty and inequality. She has written a marvelous new book, which I have had the pleasure of reading and learning from, Making the Modern Slum, The Power of Capital in Colonial Bombay, which also won the prestigious AHA Association, meaning American Historical Association's 2020 John F. Richards Prize for South Asian History. In my mind, the book is a deft and dense genealogy of multiple displacements in colonial Bombay, of agrarian distress, famished migrants, the laboring poor, at a time when the city of Bombay, rather than its people, emerges as the focus of colonial governmentality and hegemony. Sheetal has published widely, and I would urge you to look her up. My second interlocutor is our own wonderful colleague, Professor Junaid Sheikh, who is recently become an associate professor of history and has a brilliant new book, which as his colleague, I've had the privilege of hearing and reading from, but not have it in my hand as yet. The book is called Outcast Bombay, City Making and the Politics of the Poor. And it participates in many of the field formations that Junaid thinks and writes about, both in his previous career as a Bombay journalist, as well as a scholar of modern South Asian history, meaning development studies, intellectual history, labor, caste, and Dalit studies. Now, before I turn it over to their deft hands, I want to just go over a few Zoom protocols. We will mute you for now, which is, I know, a hard thing for most of us, and we will unmute you after the speakers are done. We really would urge you rather to ask your questions yourself and show yourself if you feel comfortable. All I ask is that you message me directly and say you'd like to ask a question, and I'll put it in the queue and I will call on you. I also want to remind you that the recordings of our past events, everyone from Usha Iyer to Dwai Banerjee, and many more are all, Manan Ahmed, are all on our website. If you're interested in listening to earlier events, they were all equally fantastic. And we were delighted to be the world premiere, for example, of Usha Iyer's wonderful book, Who Set Us Going. And last but not least, in the chat, we will give you discount codes, valuable things, so that you may purchase Sheetal and Junaid's books. They need the money. So please do so, Toot Sweet, and that's it. So let me turn it over to Junaid and
have you turned it over to us, Anjali?
Yes, yes, we have. Go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially for the introduction, and Anjali and Junaid for inviting me to participate in the publication of Junaid's book, which I do have here, and I just want to congratulate him, start there. I endorsed the book, and so I have a copy, I guess, because the press sent it to me, but it's an excellent read, and I encourage everyone to get it. I've been eagerly awaiting the publication of Junaid's book, as in my mind, at least, many of the questions I was left with when I finished my own book are explored in his. And as I will explain later, one particular question about the possibility for change nags me constantly, especially during the pandemic. So there's no way for me to begin not to begin rather than to acknowledge that very likely today, some 10,000 people will have died in India from COVID or COVID-related causes, and that the scale of devastation might not get better anytime soon. And that is India alone, not Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Kashmir, and this is not to even mention all the other ailments people are struggling with, completely sidelined by the COVID crisis. One of those other ailments is simple hunger. If you can believe it, in 2021, after decades of decolonization, some 15 to 35% of people in India struggle with hunger. And according to One study, at least in this past year, some 90% of people have cut down on food intake to make ends meet. In the past year alone, India's rate of poverty has almost doubled, and billionaire fortunes have grown phenomenally. While India's GDP has contracted 7.7%, India's 140 billionaires combined wealth has gone up by 90%. So by most accounts, India is a country full of not only grotesque inequality, but systems of normalization designed to produce a callous disregard for the lives of many. The journalist P. Sainath has said, quote, "A wealth surge usually rides on a misery surge. Disasters are a fabulous business. There's always money to be made in the misery of the many." That's the end of his quote. But back to COVID, some are speaking of a third wave coming, and as far as I can tell, I don't see any real plan to avert it. And I will admit personally that it is very hard for me to go on with our academic work and the rituals that accompany it, work that is often so very disconnected from or inaccessible to many of the people whose lives we claim to study, right? Some of my friends that I speak to have mourned together that there was once a time, I believe, when journalists, activists, organizers, and intellectuals got into rooms together and had collective conversations to diagnose problems, debate strategies for solutions, and do the hard work of redirecting public consciousness. That is less likely nowadays, especially amongst South Asianists in the United States, for various reasons having to do with the comfort of our distance from our site of study, as well as the caste and class privilege that characterizes most of us. Nonetheless, we really must start to think differently and find a way to be more useful. Otherwise, it'll be too late. And in many ways now, it already is. With that being said, I know Junaid was once a journalist and a reporter in Bombay as it became Mumbai in the 90s, I believe. I'm not sure exactly about that decade, but precisely when financialized real estate aligned with the Shiv Sena's agendas, and his taking up of the caste question, specifically caste as labor and caste as capital, is immensely important to forging a better future. So the main point, I'm going to talk a little bit, just about 5-10 minutes about my book. Junaid's then going to talk about his book, and we're going to exchange some questions and then open it up to the audience. So the main point of my book follows Sainath's account that basically disasters not only are a fabulous business today, but that they were even in the colonial period. A number of readers and reviewers have noted how eerily similar they find the descriptions in my book to what materialized in 2020 with the pandemic. Namely, my book opens with an image of famished migrants making their way to Bombay in the 1870s, only to be blockaded and surveilled by anxious ruling classes about the spread of contagion and non-industriousness. As many surely know, when the lockdown was announced, thousands of laborers from the cities of India found themselves victims of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore would call organized abandonment. The images of so many people walking long and grueling journeys back to their homes in the villages was hard to watch, and it was hard to even fathom that a society could allow such cruelty to its own. Such images were sadly reminiscent of descriptions in my book, famished migrants striving to enter the city during the 1870s, or even escape the city during the plague that began in 1896. Laborers who circulated between city and country have for too long been used and then disposed of in the life of the city, the life of the nation and its economy. These similarities are very important, and it is worth analyzing the structures of power that create such remarkable resilience to this organized abandonment. But as a historian, I also think it's worth thinking about the differences between then and now, because history is rarely the same way twice. So some of those similar rationales include, well, actually, hold on, I'm going to start a slide. Give me 1 second. Are you able to see that image? Yes, okay. So my book, Making the Modern Slum, explores how the well-being of the city, rather than the people in it, became the main goal of governance. As a result of repeated crises and accumulation projects, ruling classes, which includes but is not limited to the colonial state, so it includes Indian capitalists, coalesced around practices that emerged to border the city internally and externally. As a result, the laboring poor were shifted from once non-legal to legal and then illegal housing in cities worldwide by the turn of the 20th century. Reform and renewal of the city helped restore capitalist logics when they were under threat. In this way, the most basic argument is that by the early 20th century, the city became a character in a plot. People started to then, as they do now, talk about the health of the city, and perhaps even complain and mourn that their city was not as good as another city. This everyday boosterism, as it is called in studies of North Atlantic cities, justified and fueled renewal and reform projects, and appeals to the city replaced concerns with the people who lived in it. But what is a city if not the people in it? Constant renewal projects meant that the city is an effect that almost never materializes. It never did materialize, nor does it. It serves as a horizon that organizes reform projects, which almost always privilege capital over labor. As a result of a very conscious choice on my part, having to do with political reasons that I'd love to chat about, my book does not tell the stories of the laboring poor, but rather forces the reader to confront the ruling classes and the ways in which they justify and explain what they do and why. As such, it is a story of how power works, not of how power is overcome. In the beginning of the 20th century, more than 3/4 of Bombay's 1.2 million people lived in single rooms, dispersed over a variety of dwelling structures and tenure arrangements of shelter and land. These residents included factory workers, day laborers, scavengers, free persons, bonded laborers, and all but slaves. Alarmed by what was deemed the slum question, civil servant and chairman of the City of Bombay Improvement Trust, J.P. Orr, warned against the trust's rehousing projects in 1919, saying that the trust projects had, quote, resulted in the formation of what will ultimately be recognized as modern slums. One of the first things I learned as I started looking at the historical record is that the sprawling shanty towns that we associate with the slums of Mumbai today were not the first place that were called slums, nor were the fragility of building materials an index of slumness. It isn't that poorly roofed shacks didn't exist. They did, but those weren't slums. They were just shacks or huts. Officials didn't question the legitimacy of a makeshift shelter. Most such shelters existed in the northern parts of the island and along the shores, as well as in a few other locations. And the East India Company had itself authorized the building of shacks to house inhabitants during the 1830s. I can talk more about what happened in the 1830s later, but the East India Company plus the British Crown had authorized makeshift shacks numerous times. Over the subsequent decades, the very same temporary housing built by government could later be called a slum. It was even possible that city officials would praise makeshift shelters used by the laboring classes in one moment, only to target the same for reform and renewal by calling it a slum later. The image here is of a map created for the Bombay Improvement Trust, in which I have circled an area marked SH, which stands for semi-permanent huts. The semi-permanent huts have their own genealogy, and there were at least 4 moments in Bombay's history in which the government had sanctioned, condoned, and built temporary sheds and camps as shelter for migrants. The first was during those poor relief efforts during the 1830s. A second was during the famines of the 1870s. A third was during the plague of 1896, and the fourth was in the later 1920s and 30s, when the trust could not build housing as fast as it was demolishing it. So semi-permanent huts and temporary huts were built by the trust in the city, but just outside trust-acquired estates. But as you will note here in this map, still within the broader administrative boundaries of the city. These semi-permanent huts were in contrast to what the trust called slums. So the designation SH versus slum was how the city was demarcated, not just externally, but bordered on the inside, internally, with regimes of legibility that included some people and ways of life and excluded others. It was in this way that the slum emerged as the internal other of the city. And ever since then, the slum has served as a narrative resource deployed to justify city-making projects, not just in Bombay, but worldwide. The legitimate city would sometimes mean spaces that included some laborers, while at other times excluded their locales. The word slum, therefore, has neither a stable referent out there in the world, nor can its use be dismissed as arbitrary. Its occurrence in the historical record and in present practice forces us to ask why certain objects become objects of governance, and to what ends or goals is this governance ever rationalized. One of the first and primary motivators in bordering the city was to separate the space of the city from the ongoing crises in agriculture. By 1900, some 30 million people had died of famine-related causes in colonial India. During the famines of the 1870s, migrants were literally blocked out of the city. When physical roadblocks were no longer possible, distinctions between skilled and unskilled labor, industriousness as opposed to dependent populations, and slum versus makeshift housing served to sort migrants in the city and sort city space. Subsequent renewal of the city served the interests of both colonial and Indian capital, in particular during crises. Building the city thus served to separate it from agriculture, but of course, agriculture never simply disappears, nor are the variety of modes of production in it all that different from modes of production in the spaces of the city. There is, in fact, according to me, a remarkable continuity in labor-capital relations that span the continuum of rural to urban. And nowhere, not even in the North Atlantic world, is the dominance of the factory form of free labor an irreversible outcome of a linear process. All across the global South, and as we are now learning even in the global North, cheapening land, labor, and all that those produce is a common goal of capitalists, and a result, informality, unfree labor, and piecemeal work, which we now call the gig economy, can and do become the norm. This is because crises of subsistence, exchange, production, reproduction, and legitimacy are endemic to capitalism, but they rarely halt its operation. Bodies of governance, like the Improvement Trust and the Bombay Development Department, which manage space, arose within a colonial milieu, but institutionalized forms of power that are not exhausted by the term coloniality alone. Instead, they are a part of a longer history of elite capture in which public aims were repeatedly foiled by private ambitions. The longer history of caste power, a history that precedes colonialism and is not exhausted by it, is deeply important to understanding that. So spaces of poverty grew within the city, and those spaces themselves underwent stratification. In other words, the communities were not homogeneously victims of colonial capitalism. The laboring classes are in fact a varied lot amongst them, and ambitions among each that can serve to divide rather than unite against the power of capital.
Sheetal, we lost you a little bit.
Okay. Am I back now?
Yeah, you are. You were. So maybe you want to bring us back.
I was wrapping up.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Then just take it away.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, many of you will find what I have to say about cities and the way cities are used to disenfranchise the laboring classes quite pessimistic. And as I said earlier, I purposely wrote the book in that way because I wanted us to focus simply on the way power reproduces itself. But the question that lingered for me, and I think is well explored in Junaid's book, which is why I've been waiting for it, is the question of whether laboring classes across such divisions can unite against the power of capital. In my book, I didn't answer this question with any optimism, especially if you read the end. And the reason I think is because appeals to the health of the city turned into the most banal technocratic appeal that could serve to unite even middle classes with city improvers and capitalists in ways that increasingly marginalize the working classes and the poor. Actually, I'll leave it there and let's hear from Junaid about his book and see if he can give us some optimism.
Thank you, Sheetal, and thank you, Anjali. Thank you for organizing this. It's lovely to discuss the book along with Sheetal. As she told you, she wrote a blurb for the book. And I was lucky enough to get my hands on her book as I was revising the manuscript with the help of readers' reports. And so I could use and read some of her book and use it and cite it in my book too. And about optimism, I'll come to it later. And optimism it's interesting, the history of what happens with labor and caste politics in Bombay. And I'll talk a little bit about it too. But I wanted to start by saying that coronavirus is not the only virus that has mutated in India. Right? There's also capitalism and caste. And the pair have played a part in each other's mutation too. Let me elaborate. I arrived at this topic of the book via an interest in labor history. I was asked to report on some events where labor were demanding their due from the textile mills, much after the textile mills had closed down. They basically wanted remuneration. They didn't want transformation, or they didn't want their job back. They wanted remuneration. And this is 2000, 2001. So that's when I got interested in this subject. And when I was coming into a PhD program, and I started my program in 2005, one of the important debates that had happened in labor history, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, was whether capitalism and particularly class were valid categories of historical analysis. And the argument then was that, because these are Eurocentric categories, and Indian labor was still attached so much to pre-capitalist group affinities like religion and caste, that these categories, capitalism and class, may not give you as much traction or may not be as useful. Many labor historians, of course, critique this. And historians of Bombay were particularly insistent that capitalism and class were important because they were meaningful to workers in the 19th and 20th century. Right? They understood things as capitalism and as class. In translated forms, as I'll explain a little bit later. So, and these categories, they said, captured the experiences of living and working and organizing in Bombay. Right? Personally, for me, the binaries of capitalism and pre-capitalist culture, or class and caste, are not very productive. Like capitalism and class, caste and religion were also meaningful to workers. So the question was, why was this? The thesis of my book is that capitalism attached itself to class and then leached on it. Right? Caste, many of you are familiar with caste, but caste, if you're not familiar, is a social hierarchy. And because it is a social hierarchy, there is an ideology that justifies class. And that ideology, of course, is purity and pollution in the case of caste. But caste is also a social practice. And because it's a social practice, it can transform, mutate, and adapt to situations. My focus in the book was on the lowest castes, which are the untouchables and the Dalit castes. Right? So if you are starting an industry, so let me explain this a little bit, how it's leaching onto caste. Now, if you were starting a cotton textile industry at the end of the 19th century, right, what you needed, of course, most importantly to start an industry is capital. Right? To lay your hands on that capital, because there is no nationalized bank as we have in post-colonial South Asia, to get that capital, capitalists, and these are merchants who have made their money in the opium trade, who are now putting some of their money in starting textile industries, they rely on caste and kinship networks. Right? So caste is fundamental to first raising money, the capital itself. Right? Then after you raise your capital and you start an industry, you import technology from Europe, particularly UK. And now you've started an industry. The other thing you need, of course, is labor. And not just X amount of labor, but X plus more, X plus Y amount of labor. Because that Y amount of labor will drive down the wages. So if you needed, let's say, 1,000 workers in the cotton textile industry, you would want 50,000 workers turning up so that you would drive down the wages. And India always was a low paid and Bombay particularly, and textile industry particularly, was always a low-paid, low-skilled economy. Right. So once you've gotten all these laborers to the city, the way you get those laborers also, of course, is dependent on caste. You send out recruitment agents who tap their caste and kinship networks to get labor from various from the countryside into the city. The way they do it, of course, and the reason why they do it, or the reason why the mill owners ask them to do it in this way, is so that A, they can discipline the workers. Right? You can coax them to work for 10, 12, 14 hours. You can provide them credit, patronage, so that they remain loyal to you. And most importantly, you also provide them with some housing so that they can be housed in one place. Right? Now, in a low-skilled, low-paid economy, where the wages are low, you can't afford rents. Right? So some of the and most of the workers, therefore, are housed in tenements, privately owned tenements, because of questions of caste. Some of the Dalit workers, and Dalit workers are the focus of, Dalits are the focus of this book. Dalits can't find housing in particular tenements, and they start squatting on land or live in huts. And as Sheetal was also saying, therefore, slums are important, and slums are instrumental to industrial capitalism in Bombay city. Right? That's where you house the low-skilled workers. So as industrial capitalism grows, you have slums. Even when industrial capitalism, as we understand it, which is big factories employing hundreds of workers, even if that declines in Bombay city in the 1980s, manufacturing shifts to the slums by the 1990s. Right? So slums are the place where now manufacturing is happening, either in handlooms or then other types of manufacturing. So slums, even after industrial capitalism, industries are closing down, slums still are a feature of Bombay. So caste plays an important role in housing too. Now, the government, when it's the Bombay Improvement Trust that Sheetal was talking about, when they build tenements to house workers, they consider caste as an important criteria in allotting housing. So there are tenements for particular castes, particularly Dalit castes, in these Bombay Improvement Trust housing. Right. Now, by the early 20th century, there is also the beginning of the cooperative movement. The question, of course, with the cooperative movement is who cooperates. The Bombay government, the Indian government, came up with the idea that castes would be the basis of starting cooperatives in India. And therefore, you see the beginning of caste cooperative housing or cooperative housing society based on caste in Bombay from the 20th century. So many upper castes and upper middle and upper middle class, they end up forming cooperative housing societies based on castes. Right? Our friend Nikhil Rao has written about this. You also see the beginning of the Saraswat housing societies in Bombay. So it's not just, so caste is instrumental not just in shaping housing in the city, but because it's about the beginning of housing societies, it's also shaping urban planning in the city too. Right? So some of my, so the book explores urban planning too, as it does the history of capitalism in Bombay. But now, and by the 1920s and 1930s, Dalits are also trying to lobby the government to give them land and credit to start cooperative societies for Dalits. And you see the emergence of cooperative societies for Dalits by the 1930s in Bombay. Right? So that's about caste and housing and even urban planning. which you see in the beginning of the 20th century, is also shaped by caste. Now, workers, by the 1920s, there is a Marxist movement that emerges in Bombay city. Right? This Marxist movement, of course, and this Marxist movement is also being transformed in Bombay city. Yeah. So if the point with Marxism, for instance, there are 2 points I want to emphasize. That's where I use the category of translation. Marxism, as I'm saying, is also changes. It has to be translated in order to understand what's happening in Bombay city. Right? So translation is also cultural, I'm using it as translation between cultures, when a set of ideas are then used to understand what's happening in Bombay city. And Bombay's Marxists try and translate Marx and Marxism in order to understand the history of Bombay and particularly industrial capitalism in Bombay. Right? Therefore, if Marxism is proposing a capital socialist revolution, a political and social revolution, Marxists had to say something about caste, because of course caste is a social hierarchy. What do they say about caste? How do they understand caste? Right? According to them, they go through the stages of development thesis. According to them, there used to be an Aryan commune in South Asia, in India, in Indian antiquity. Note the word Aryan commune, a very racial caste term. That commune then starts degenerating with the emergence of division of labor. That division of labor becomes caste. And then caste starts becoming more and more and more complex in India's medieval history and early modern history. And with the coming of capitalism, that caste is unhinged or starts becoming weak. And the Marxists, by bringing about a Marxian or a communist revolution, the Marxists will then get rid of caste, right? Or caste will become redundant. Right? That's the thesis. That's the way they adapted it to understand caste in India, because of course, they're talking about a social revolution, revolution that will follow a political revolution. Translation, the way I use it, is also the linguistic practice. So in order to understand, to make Marx meaningful in South Asia to the mostly Marathi reading and Marathi speaking workers, they had to translate Marx into Marxian categories into Marathi. And in the way that they translate certain Marxian categories, particularly the abstract categories, right? Categories like use value, for instance. Those categories get translated in heavily Sanskritized Marathi. And when they translate embodied categories, like lumpen proletariat, they use the urban slang. So in this linguistic practices too, you see a hierarchy in translation. And with the result that both these forms of translation, you see the presence of caste. Because in the first one, because the social revolution, the political revolution will happen, and then the social revolution will follow after that. What the implication was that if you're demanding something in the name of caste, so when the Dalit movements emerge in the 1920s, or the anti-Brahmin movements emerge in the 1920s, those movements were deemed reactionary because they are highlighting and holding on to caste. Because in their analysis, caste has been loosened by capitalism and will disappear with the communist revolution. So the second chapter of the book talks about that. The third, fourth, and the fifth chapters, which takes me into the 1940s and a period beyond, then I run into a problem which can only be termed as a problem of the post-colonial government anticipating Anjali Arundekar's critique of the colonial archive. And the critique of our archive, of course, is that she has questioned our desire to access knowledge. The post-colonial governments found out a wonderful solution to this problem. They decided not to maintain too many archives. Right? So now the desire to access the historical truth of post-colonial Bombay through state archives or the archives of the Bombay Municipal Corporation becomes a distant dream. Right? I have a couple of friends who have seen some documents in the Bombay Municipal Corporation. So ostensibly, there may be some archive there. Right? But most people have been denied access to, don't have access to these archives. So then the question is, there's a learning there, which is that the fetishization of the archives is even bigger and deeper when there are no archives. Right? Because you miss the archives, you don't know what's happening. So then in the third, fourth, and fifth chapter, I had to be a little creative. I used housing reports, urban housing reports, and urban planning reports, in which slums play an important role as a space that needed to be dealt with, disciplined, evicted, reformed. Bombay itself needed to be transformed by either spreading Bombay horizontally, which is suburbanizing Bombay, and then spreading it vertically, which is giving more permissions for more high-rise buildings, a feature that you see now. The plans had been laid out in the 50s and 60s for this. Also starting a doppelganger of Bombay called New Bombay, a new city itself, which will take care of much of the overflow from Bombay. I juxtapose the slums in these urban plans and housing reports in the 50s, 60s, 70s with the slums of Dalit literature. Right? Many Dalit scholars had grown up in these slums. In their stories, they write about these slums. Right? So I juxtapose these slums, but of course now it's a field of literature, something I'm not an expert in. So I had to be attentive to the power that is within that field itself. Right? So what are some of the debates that happen in Dalit literature as they're talking about these slums, characters in the slums? And the lumpen proletariat and the sex worker become important characters in stories and poems written by Dalit writers. Right? So some of these Dalit writers, so because I'm looking at some of the power and the formation of the field itself, then some of the chapter also gets into the transnational history of where they tried to find inspiration. They found inspiration from the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, African-American literature. They tried to translate all of that, or at least invoke all of that in their writing. They had read many of the writers in translations, particularly some of the Russian realists they had read in translations in Marathi. Some of the Dalit writers also started the Dalit Panther movement, inspired by the Black Panther movement. Right? And as Dalit Panthers, they again wanted to bring about a social and a political revolution. They wanted to get rid of class and caste simultaneously. Right? They tried to do many things. They also wanted to start a vigilante group which would visit areas where Dalits have been Dalit had experienced violence, particularly in the countryside. Most of those plans did not work out for a political and a social revolution. But one important thing that the Dalit Panthers did succeed in was they advocated to make some slums durable. And by durable is to get some tenure rights to some slums. And I'm saying some slums, not all slums. So some slums and some slum dwellers got tenurial rights. They were made permanent, and that is why they became durable. And because they could become permanent, they could then get electricity, and they could get some provisions for sanitation, etc. Right? One of the achievements of the Dalit Panther movements, but Dalit Panther movement also fissured within a couple of years, right? All along ideological lines, along political lines, which has been the history of Dalit politics. It has never been able to establish itself, or an autonomous Dalit politics never comes about, right? It always fissures. So by the end of the 1970s, the Dalit Panthers has fissured. The labor movement, in which Marxists had played an important role, and in which, of course, Dalits were also participants. They were always allies of the labor movement. That labor movement itself is fissuring. And by the 1980s, after a historical strike in Bombay, the labor movement collapses, and the mill lands then have been disappear, or the owners realize that they can sell their real estate and make more money rather than continue with their mills. Right? So most mills are then start getting converted into either shopping malls or luxury apartments. Right? And towards the middle of that process was my entry into Bombay city. But this question of revolution, which always kept sparking up again and again, and everybody in Bombay invokes revolution at various moments, right? From the Marxists, from actually urban planners to invoke revolution for different ends, but they also use the term revolution. They want to revolutionize Bombay space for the flow of capital, etc. Of course, right? Dalit leaders, Dalit social movements use the term revolution. This revolution, of course, is an aspiration, and it keeps coming up again and again. And even after the collapse of the labor movement and the Dalit Panther movement, that aspiration has not disappeared. Right? Even now, you'll find Dalit leaders who and various other Marxists who embrace this idea of a revolution. Of course, these days they are being called urban naxals, and then they find themselves in jail more frequently than they would like to be. That's another story, of course. But this imagination of a revolution does not disappear. Revolution in practice, what they can achieve, of course, is very limited. So that's, I am afraid that I may not be as pessimistic as Sheetal says she is, but I am also, the history suggests that those revolutions were wonderful rhetoric, but they did not do what they claimed. They did achieve certain other things, made some slums durable, for instance. So let me pause here, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more.
Thank you, Junaid. I'm going to invite Sheetal and Junaid maybe to chat with each other for 10 minutes, because I know I have a ton of questions, and I know many of y'all do. So maybe Sheetal and Junaid, y'all can, throw down the gauntlet a little bit for us, because y'all are saying, in many ways, very different things, even though there's a lot of convergence. So Sheetal, y'all want to take it away for about 10 minutes, and I will tell you when 10 minutes are up.
Okay, sure. If you don't mind, Junaid, I'll just make a comment and a question first. I just want to underscore, I guess, the importance of Junaid's work, in which basically the way he describes caste as capital and caste as labor. He talked about the networks of affiliation that allow capitalists to raise capital to make something happen, and then also command labor, right? This is not the most common way caste is talked about. We have volumes of literature that talk about caste in other ways. And as Junaid said, even the Marxists sometimes think that both capitalism and socialism will once erase caste, and it's not, and it's a reactionary sort of movement. That kind of analysis, I think, also allows us to think about segregation is the word that's used in North Atlantic cities, right? About spaces that become so segregated. I'm in Chicago now, and the North Side and the South Side are very distinct places, right? But we couldn't say the same about colonial Bombay. Cities in India are much more mixed and not segregated in that neat way. And yet there's an important way in which the stuff you've said is really about segregation, the technologies of segregation that depend on each other and yet involve keeping things separate. And notably, it's not about black town, white town, right? There's other vectors of power that get much closer to the ground. So I think those are all very important things. I think the biggest question that that we have to wrestle with, I think, as a community of scholars, I guess, is that there's tensions in the 20th century between communist politics and anti-caste politics. And those tensions have often been quite stifling. The Marxists, Junaid talks about in chapter 2, like Tange, sort of become frustrated with anti-Brahmin movements, right? And they don't mention caste. Like Junaid had to do a lot of work to find how they talk about caste, because they often don't. And then there are also anti-caste movements that are not sufficiently anti-capitalist, right? In my own study of, this is my sort of question, very broad, my own study of the Black Marxists in the US or in the North Atlantic world, it seems like there's a clear line in the sand. They assume, or Black Marxists tend to say, you cannot have anti-capitalist politics without centering Blacks. And you cannot have anti-race politics without also having anti-capitalist politics. And that's a very clear dividing line that Black scholars have amongst themselves, or Black activists have amongst themselves. I don't think we have sharpened that line, either for good reasons or bad. I'm not sure. But we, right. So, I mean, that's just sort of an open-ended invitation to think about that. I don't know if you agree with my characterization.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And that's, you can see that in the history of Bombay itself. And, you know, the communist movement, the Dalit movement, the anti-Brahmin movements are all coming up at the same time, right? Particularly the Dalit movement and the communist movement. The anti-Brahmin movement was there, of course, in the 19th century too, or at least there was an anti-Brahmin rhetoric from that time. But in the way, for instance, in Bombay city, there were many strikes, particularly in 1928 and 29. Right, those were the long years. The 2 years, there were 2 strikes totaling up to almost 18 months. Right? Some of the most successful strikes in the history of Bombay. In the first strike, for instance, Ambedkar and some of Ambedkar's followers are supportive of the strike, but they are circumspect too. Right? And one of the reasons why they are circumspect is because they're saying that these communists, and Ambedkar says in one of his articles, or one of the journals that he starts, is that I'm afraid that the communists have their heads in Russia, but their bodies are in India. And because of that, they're not understanding caste and the importance of caste. Right? So in order to support the 1928 strike, then he says that let them, in one of the demands, they said that you should at least acknowledge that caste is shaping the employment practice of Dalit workers, or caste is shaping the employment of Dalit workers. They're not getting well-paid jobs. Right? So one of the demands from the mill owners is that they should get better paying jobs. Now the mill owners are very smart, right? They turned it around and they said, you know, this seems like this question is between the laborers. Right? It seems like there are caste practices among laborers, which is preventing Dalits from getting well-paid jobs. It has nothing to do with us. So you sort it out.
So what does that mean, Junaid? So they're saying basically, so casted laborers are excluding outcast laborers.
Yeah, absolutely. So in practice, when you have the communist unions, in practice, the way they worked is that caste laborers are excluding outcast labor, Dalit laborers. So Dalits are demanding better employment, but they're demanding better employment of the mill owners, because it's a demand for the strike. Mill owners are saying, but we can't do anything because it's a problem between you. So you figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course,
this is why sorry, I was just going to say, this is why I always say, I think the cleverest capitalists in the world are Indian capitalists.
No, absolutely.
They find a way. Yeah,
absolutely. And see, and Ambedkar and then his followers, I mean, they are learning and they are responding to the Marxist movement. So when the elections happened in India for the first time, the provincial elections of the 1930s, of 1937, Ambedkar has started a party. And those were actually some of his most radical years. And in one of his speeches, he says that both Brahminism and capitalism have to go. Right? So he's acknowledged that both of them are a problem. Caste and capitalism are a problem. Both have to go. But yet at the same time, of course, Ambedkar is also a complicated figure, because at the same time, Ambedkar is also lobbying the colonial government to give land to Dalits so that they can start cooperative housing societies and accumulate private property. It's almost around the same time he's saying the same thing. Right? So again, these are complicated issues, but it's really heartening that Ambedkar had in the 1930s said that capitalism and caste both have to go, which that never comes on the agenda of the Marxists for the longest time. Right? They said, let the class revolution happen and caste will then disappear on its own. Ambedkar and other Dalits said, let the revolution deal with both simultaneously. And the Marxists
had ask one quick follow-up.
Yeah.
The Dalit housing cooperatives,
yeah,
when they're made, what is the diagnosis for why the housing conditions are so bad? What is the source of the problem for them?
For them, that there is no availability of land and no availability of credit to buy land, right, or build housing.
So it's not that they're paid too little for work. It's not that they're exploited.
For the housing cooperatives. So, but for the labor, I mean, during the strikes, of course, they want more, better pay, etc. They want better paying jobs, right? For the tenements, the built by the government of Bombay or the BDD and the BIT, they want Dalits to get a share of the housing. All that is there. But for cooperatives, it's land and credit.
Thank you.
No, and I also wanted to, and I've been, unlike most historians, they don't reveal the theoretical apparatus. But you reveal that very early on in your acknowledgements itself. Right? When you're asking, you're thanking a friend for helping you with Foucault and with Marx. Right? So I wanted to talk about this theoretical apparatus, and for your argument, which I see that capital aligns with the state and institutions of the state, and created the space for the circulation of capital, right? I mean, that's if I were to just zero down your argument or put it in a nutshell. So for this argument, of course, these theories are wonderful, but how did you arrive at these theories? Was it the time in which we were getting trained, and probably we were getting trained at the same time, we were in graduate school at the same time? And how did they help you construct your archive? And how did your archive convince you that these are the thinkers you should be working with?
So I have to say, when I was in graduate school, I was not a fan of Foucault, and I say that embarrassingly. And I realized why that was because I think a lot of scholars who use Foucault do not connect him to questions of political economy. So it was much after I had graduated, I read Security, Territory, Population, and I saw how much Foucault's ideas were, even I don't think he did as good a job connecting it to political economy either, but it was definitely not disconnected. A lot of the disciplinary forms and things that he's describing have to do with particular socioeconomic relations. And he even talks about the repeatedness of crises and crises of legitimacy and all these things. So since I was interested in the reproduction of the power of capital, it seemed important to then think about the ways in which certain things become normalized. I think in our emails, you had asked about why do things look similar today as to the time in your book, right? And I think that has a lot to do with the normalization of certain things, the normalization of the idea of the city, right? And what fantasies does the city invoke? And that is something that emerges early in the century and is much more alive today, right? Another thing that becomes normalized is if you think about the pandemic, COVID is never going to go away. It's going to become endemic. And in fact, there are lots of diseases endemic to India. Many people die of all sorts of diseases in India. I've written an article about this called Manufacturing Epidemics. And what does it mean for an illness to become endemic? It means that there's a certain level we tolerate and we decide upon whom we're going to tolerate it. And so that even that fact, that category of endemicity is something that allows us to normalize the power of capital, really. And then the normalization of low expectations, low wages, a level of hunger, nonsensical Malthusian stuff, right? That was said long before COVID about how India's population is too high. And of course, the most normalized idea is the economy itself, that the economy is some god that we all have to serve constantly. And in my book, the city serves as the space of the economy before the idea of the economy emerges, right? So I don't think it was.
Sorry, may I interrupt here? And because I feel like your questions and your comments are probably generating a lot for our audience. So would you be open to taking a couple of questions and then we can return back to you? I already have Gyan. Gyan, do you want to set us off?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I want to start with Sheetal's question that she posed to Junaid, which is about how Black Marxists in the US have always seen a connection between race and capitalism. And it's become even more apparent in the last few years that that connection is made. And not only by Black Marxists, but Black activists in general now make that connection. Now, Indian Marxists never, as Junaid said, made that connection between caste and capitalism. But I'm wondering if in your reading of Dalit activists, whether Marxists or not, even with, let's say, Dalit Panthers, first, do they make the kind of stark connection that the Black Marxists make between race and capital? Do they make that kind of connection? Because my sense is that, from what you actually said, just in response to Sheetal earlier, about sort of internal divisions among the workers, that caste is a kind of a structure that doesn't work like race. And so that kind of, let's say, treating Brahmanism as white supremacy.
Right.
Does that kind of work? I mean, do they make that sort of argument where, Dalits then become kind of personification of everything that is wrong with Brahmanism and that it affects all other castes as well? So I'm just wondering that, because I was thinking of even, Samyukt Maharashtra movement and so on, through all of these movements, there have been mobilization of, OBC, other, Maratha castes and so on. And so how does, making sort of Dalit versus Brahmanism kind of parallel to Black Marxist argument kind of actually work?
And that's a great question, Gyan, because it really, that's the beauty of Brahmanism, that, that dichotomy, sharp dichotomy doesn't happen because between that are many other layers of caste. Right? So in the 1920s and so, for instance, there is an affinity between the anti-Brahmin politics of the Maratha caste, which is the middle caste or the agrarian community. In fact, Ambedkar's education is funded by some of the members of the Maratha caste. So there is sort of an affinity between right, between the Maratha caste and the Dalit caste at one level. But at the level of work in the textile industry, that falls down. And between the Maratha caste and the Dalit caste, there are, in rural areas, there have always been tensions. And in urban areas, in a place like Bombay City, in jobs, there have also been tensions because, as I was explaining, in practice, they don't allow Dalits to get into some of the high-paid work. Right? So between Brahminism and Dalit politics, this antithesis that you are identifying, that never quite works out because there are multiple castes in between. Importantly, one of the what an interesting thing that happens in the 1930s is until the 1920s, there is this tension between the anti-Brahmin movement, the anti-Brahmin and the upper caste, anti-Brahmin movement and the Congress Party. Interestingly, what happens by the 1930s, anti-Brahmin movement is now becomes part of the Congress Party, gets co-opted by the Congress Party, and leaves its alliance with Dalit politics. And in that, again, then there is that tension. Now, Ambedkar feels that he's been left to dry by an ally that he had, a possible ally that he had. Right? So that sharp dichotomy between Brahmins and Dalits is in politics, I mean, in rhetoric, it's there. But in politics, they have to deal with then many other things. You know, they have to deal with many other castes, including the Maratha caste.
No, it might be interesting to think about the parallel, though, which is that in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, after abolition, it's white industrialists and capitalists and landowners that pull white farmers up out of poverty so that they can ally with them against Blacks. So even for Black Marxists, it's not white supremacy or anti-whiteness is not the politics. The politics is about class stratification that happens under the guise of white supremacy at the bottom of the pyramid, which I think is quite similar to the way in which OBC versus Dalit politics plays out. I mean, not just politics, but even violence and debate over resources.
But Du Bois also talk about how the ideology of...
I do think there's a...
Sorry. I was saying that doesn't Du Bois also speak about how the ideology of white supremacy, tries to draw in white working class and so on against their own interests. Well, anyway.
Yes. So isn't that the same, though, as drawing in low caste people into Hindutva politics?
Which happens much later in the 1980s and 1990s. Right?
Yes.
And with Maratha politics, because they were able to form cooperative societies again, they become politically very dominant. Numerically, they are dominant in Western India, and similar castes in other parts of India, like the Reddys, for instance, and all that. Numerically, they are dominant in particular areas, but economically, they also become prominent through cooperative societies, agrarian cooperative societies.
Thank you, Gyan. I think that question has sort of opened a Pandora's box in many ways of many questions I know people will have. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to ask a question. Sheetal, just a heads up, you're sort of breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure if it's your connection or so. If I will message you or something if you do.
If I do keep breaking up, I'm going to shut my video, just so everyone knows.
Okay, that's great. I mean, not great. We'd love to keep seeing you, but whatever works. Yes, thank you. So I have a question. I will preface it by saying I've read Sheetal's book. I know of Junaid's work through talks and small pieces of writing he shared. So Junaid, you'll forgive me if you've already answered this question. So Sheetal, my question, the main tension I see between both of your projects is where they converge is that you refuse to think about the city as a spatial concept, right? Bombay is not a spatial concept. It's a concept mediated through these genealogies. Junaid, in your case, through industrialization, caste, Sheetal, in your case, through agrarian politics, poverty politics, etc. But my question is that, Sheetal, you end, and you gesture to that ending in your book by sort of talking about the kind of famous trade union politics, right, as being, in fact, a profoundly failed project that sustained urban capitalism than not. So I was wondering what you would say vis-a-vis the kind of robust history that Junaid is providing us of a kind of different organizing that's caste fueled, right, through these translations, etc. So that's my question for you. And Junaid, my question for you is, again, I have not read this book, so you can, slap me later if this is a question you've already answered. But where is Dalit feminism, yaar? Like, I'm thinking about Urmila Pawar, Baby Kamble, and sort of Ambedkar's, in sort of thing, leave the village, go to the city, right? And how Dalit feminists, particularly Urmila Pawar, talks about these conflicts. So I was curious to hear, and I'm not asking the foundational question of gender, why don't you write about gender, but as a kind of epistemological intervention into how caste and capital are converging, and where they are appearing. I have a lot more to say, but those are the two things that come to mind. Whatever you fancy, and then we have other people who want to ask questions. Sheetal, do you want to answer my? If you don't, that's fine.
I'll just say quickly that when I wrote the ending of the book, I was very nervous because I knew that I was basically critiquing that labor movement, but I wanted to make that explicit. I guess I see lots of dangers in kinds of organizing. I mean, Foucault talked about dangers, right? It's not just the case that one can demand higher wages or higher representation in a certain set of politics without then also invoking or creating possibility for new kinds of dangers and co-optations. So I used the phrase movements and counter movements in there. I think this goes back to Gyan's question though, about I think we have to become so much clearer on is there a possibility for Dalit Marxism? I think this is, and what would Dalit Marxism look like? And in a very precise way, not just demands for more space within a city, but exactly how would it be anti-capitalist and anti-caste at the same time? And that's the sort of thing I really struggle with. So I don't have an answer. I just have more questions. But.
Junaid?
Yeah, and with Dalit Marxism, actually, see, as Anupama Rao's recent translation of R.B. More shows that there were Dalit Marxists from the 1920s onwards, right? They've been there. But I think the leftist formation that appreciates and understands the question of caste really are the Maoists, right? Which is why by the 1960s and 70s, they get a lot of traction. And even since then. So they understand that caste is an issue that some of their followers, particularly agrarian workers, are facing. They recognize that and they say that we will deal with that. So I guess, and then there are other, maybe not Dalit intellectuals, but intellectuals that are very important to Dalits. For instance, somebody like Sharad Patil, right, who is not a Dalit intellectual, has been critiqued by people, but he also is struggling with the question of caste and capitalism, and he thinks of caste as the and I may be here, I may be slightly misquoting, caste as the consciousness of India and anti-caste as the unconscious. So he makes an argument like that. And he says that it's the job of activists, particularly and Dalit activists, to make that anti-caste the consciousness. And that can only happen through organizing. Sharad Patil, of course, also has a very interesting history. He was part of the Marxist movement, but by the 1980s, he is disillusioned by many of most strands of Marxism, except he's open to Maoism again, right? As I was mentioning, that some of them find traction in Maoism. He's open to Maoism, has a critique of the implementation of Maoism, but he's open to Maoism. So he's saying that this unconscious, which is anti-caste, has to be made the conscious, which can only happen through organizing.
Thank you, Junaid. We'll take 2 more questions before we let these lovely people off. I have Usha Iyer first and then Navyug. Usha, go ahead.
Thank you. And congratulations, Junaid. I'm so excited. I have a copy of the book.
Thanks.
And looking forward to reading it over the summer. So maybe you're answering the questions I have in the book, but I thought it would give you an opportunity to speak about them. To follow up on that question of Black Marxism and the comparisons, I was thinking about the plantation as a very particular apparatus of social oppression and of ecological disaster, and thinking of the mill in Bombay as a kind of very particular kind of industrial formation. Does that help us parse some of these differences? Even when the Dalit Panthers are kind of modeling themselves or inspired by the Black Panthers, these longer histories of the industrial formations that they're drawing out these quote unquote local Marxisms from. And in that, what is the specificity of Maharashtra's caste formations and of Bombay within that as a city, how kind of regional histories, colloquial traditions, the Marathi common sense, kind of what is the role that all of this plays? Because I'm thinking about the proximity of Goa and Gujarat and these are 2 kind of places that are central to the formation of Bombay's cosmopolitan kind of nature as well, and of Muslim and Christian populations, right? So this is a very particular both industrial formation as well as just in terms of the city. And then a separate question, which you might not get to, is do you also think about Marxism's purchase in Africa and in Latin America during this period? Because ethnic differences might be somewhat, tell us something about caste in the way that just the master-slave, black-white, racial kind of narrative might not. And that therefore we don't find race and caste kind of easily folding onto each other.
No, these are lovely questions, and I probably may not be able to do justice to them. With the Dalit Panthers, for instance, and as you know, with Jyotirao Phule, there was already by the 19th century, there was an understanding of the conditions of African Americans, blacks in the US by the 19th century itself, right? With the Dalit Panthers, it's also the particular history of their formation, right? They're getting formed in the 1970s, early 1970s, right? In which many of them have heard from their childhood, they've heard Marxists speak. They've attended meetings of Marxists, right? They've attended meetings of socialists. So they have what Marathi Marxists have said. They have heard that, and they have attended meetings of the Ambedkarite movement, right? So their analysis of caste, particularly the question of caste, they've heard all that. So their formation is through these multiple ideas that their presence in Bombay helps them engage with, right? And Dalit Panther, most importantly, of course, is also a product of the global 1960s. Right? So some of the leaders of the global 1960s, icons of the global 1960s, from Cruz to Frantz Fanon to the Black Panther movement, have become the leaders of the Dalit Panthers. Right? Now, the understanding of race and their understanding of Black history, from what they have written, I have not been able to see how they engage with it. Right? I remember talking to one of the founders of the Dalit Panthers when I was doing my fieldwork as a PhD student. And he had mentioned that there were some activists from America who had flown into India and had given them an encyclopedia of slavery. And he was not clear about what the title of the book was. After coming back, I asked many people, I searched. But he said that really helped us. That really helped us understand. But what exactly that book was, he couldn't tell me, and I couldn't locate that, what it was. Right. So there is that. So they had some understanding. I don't know how deep of an understanding of Black history, the long history of racism in America they had. They had an understanding, though, of some of the African American literature and the themes that were opened up by African American literature, and they had an understanding of that through people who had traveled to America. Some Dalit intellectuals, Ambedkar had started a scholarship, and some Dalit intellectuals managed to come to America in the 60s, 1960s, particularly a figure like M.N. Wankhede. And through him and his writing, and he wrote a book on, he wrote a dissertation on, I think he called it the Black African American literature or something. His term in Marathi was Negro Sahitya. So he wrote a dissertation on that. So through him, they understood some questions. I don't know how deep of a study of the plantation economy or the long African American history and the relationship between race and capitalism. I don't know how deep of a study they had.
Thank you, Junaid. Usha, I think that's a question that is worth thinking about more, because it expands out into different histories of slavery, not just the Atlantic model, which I think, I mean, Junaid, I was going to ask you the Goa question, because as you know, I write about Marathas in Goa, and Maratha is a very different, caste possibility. Absolutely. So that's a conversation we will have after this event when you stay on Zoom and chat. I want to leave the last word to my comrade Navyu, who is also an esteemed historian of labor. Navyu, take it away.
Sure. So thank you both. Fantastic conversation. When I actually saw the title, I actually thought the Desi Katta, and I thought it would be some kind of a shootout between the two of you. So that's good that there's multiple meanings of these things. And I think lots of other sort of cities and towns are sort of jealous that Bombay gets such fantastic historians. So I have two questions for you both, and I have Sheetal's book, and I'm looking forward to getting Junaid's. The first question is, I think Junaid, you were talking about capitalism attaching itself to caste and then leeching off of it, and the sort of mutation of caste. And it made me think, mutation, if caste is mutating, then or in capital is mutating, what is the patient zero of this mutation and sort of deviations? Wow. But the actual question is, in the framing of capitalism and caste, and it's probably there in the book, but you didn't say as much about the role of the state in that relationship. And so I was wondering, what is the role of the state in this mutation? Does the state also mutate? And are you following the sort of conventional divisions of sort of company Raj to Crown Raj, and then sort of post-colonial and post-80s, or is there a different way of mapping the state in the relationship between capitalism and caste? So I was wondering about that. The second question, you kind of spoke about it and sort of taken it in different directions, both of you have, but we actually hear a lot about how Marxists and union leaders or Eurocentric, sort of applying European categories mechanically. They're not able to take on caste or gender seriously. It has to be told and retold. I'm in full agreement. I wonder, and it made me think about, why are capitalists so successful in pursuing their interests? Right? So the real question is, does caste present any unique or fundamental challenge to the accumulation of capital in Bombay? Does capital in Bombay just make use of caste? Is it indifferent to caste? How does that sort of, how does the story look from the other side? And is there a difference between the two of you? Because I get a sense maybe Sheetal has a different take on this. So I'm wondering how you guys sort of see that dynamic. Thank you. Look forward to reading the books.
That was a Desi Katta. I like it. Go for it.
Shall I take it?
Yeah, please, Junaid. And then we'll have Sheetal to have the last word.
Yeah. So now those are great questions. And, with state, of course, my historical understanding is really comes out of social history. where there is a group of people, then there is capital, and then there is the state, right? And the history is written through the interaction of labor with capital and the state, right? And of course, the state and the capital are aligned in various ways. So the state, in at least my work, is, I mean, state, of course, which Sheetal's work lays out in much detail, actually. State and its technologies of governance, its classificatory apparatus is very important here, right? Because the state, when has already in its practice affirmed the importance of caste for various things, including housing and cooperatives and urban planning, right? And in that sense, the state makes it easier for capitalists to latch onto caste, right? And with the capitalists themselves, caste here, for them, caste is a way of, is the way caste, what it offers the capitalists is an inbuilt system of hierarchy, right? In which many people can be rendered redundant or excess, right? Particularly those who landless laborers, etc., can be rendered excess. So for them, it doesn't. For them, they don't have to do anything with caste, right? I mean, they don't want to disturb this. It gives them an inbuilt system of hierarchy which they can work with, from which they can leech on. So if anything, they are interested in making, their practice makes caste stronger. So, and this is what happens in Bombay too, right? So you get so many people in Bombay, and you drive down the wages, make them live in slums, hire them as strike breakers when people go on strike. Right? And this is the history of Bombay in the 20th century.
Sheetal?
Yeah, I agree with what Junaid said. I think if caste didn't exist, capitalists would have probably invented it. I mean, it works really well. So there's so much more I could say. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson's caste, I think, is describing a sedimentation of racial life in America that maybe has existed much longer in India already. Right? I don't know, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
For sure. I think that's a good note to end on, because it demonstrates so much more that needs to be done about many of the questions that you have sort of uncovered. But I thank you both for your wonderful book. Sheetal, your book was a page turner for me. Junaid, I look forward to it. Again, people buy their books, they need the money. The discount codes are in the chat. And thank you again for coming. I know it's an extraordinarily busy time and everyone's beyond exhausted with Zoom, but I can speak for myself when I say it was really, really wonderful to see all of you. And please stay safe. And I hope all of you continue to return next year for our series. Jai Bhim, and see you all soon. Junaid, will you stay on a little bit?
Yeah.
Thank you all.